Hello, it's Miss Heather, piano and voice teacher at Conservatory of the Ozarks, and today I'm recording a boring study guide video that probably won't be interesting to anybody except for me to watch, but it's about the Oxford movement. It's the 5th question on my Hymnody study guide, so I'm going to try and answer it without looking at my notes and then check and see if I got it right. So, the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was preceded in the late 1700s by the rationalist movement or the Enlightenment in Germany. And the rationalist movement kind of wreaked havoc on hymnody in its era. So rationalism had an effect both on the text and the tunes of hymns. The rationalists didn't like anything that had to do with supernatural, so they didn't want references to miracles or anything like that in the hymn text. So they would alter the original hymn text, they would omit stanzas they didn't like, and they nearly abandoned the Kernlieder in their hymnals. And so obviously that has a negative effect on the hymn texts. It really changed the meanings of the texts from what they were originally intended to mean. The rationalist movement also had an effect on hymn tunes. They forced Luther's hymns into inflexible time signatures, and they really embraced isorhythms, which robbed the hymns of the inherent life that the original rhythmic melodies had breathed into the German texts. So that wasn't so nice. They also like to have a slow tempo for their hymns, regardless of the feeling or the mood of the hymn, and they like to insert a lot of showy interludes between the stanzas and have lots of slides and slurs that made the hymns better suited to the singing of a trained soloist rather than the congregation of enthusiastic amateurs. As a result, the congregants became a little bit relegated again to being spectators in the service rather than participants. And they, outside of the service, they also were singing the hymns less because the hymns were more difficult to sing and they were less fun to sing. So hymn singing in German churches really went downhill during the Enlightenment. In the early 1800s, the Oxford movement was a reaction to the rationalist movement, and their agenda in the Oxford movement coincided with the pietist agenda from the past. And the Oxford movement was also called the Tractarian movement in England. The Tractarian movement lasted from 1833 to 1841. Tracts for Our Times was popular at that time. People wrote all these tracts for people to read. And in Germany it was called the Confessionalist movement, or the Confessionalist revival. And the people involved in this movement saw the rationalist movement as a problem, and they were trying to fix the problem. So in the context of hymnody, they wanted to restore the original rhythmic melodies to the hymns rather than using the isorhythmic melodies. They also wanted to restore all of the original stanzas to the hymns, and they wanted to restore the Kernlieder to the hymnals. And so that was nice that they wanted to bring that back. But they also wanted to go even farther back. They felt that the reformers in the Protestant Reformation had thrown out too much from the past, and so the people involved in the Oxford movement went even farther back past the Protestant Reformation to the early church and to the breviary to look for things to bring back. And they were selective. They didn't just bring back every bit of music from the ancient past of Christianity. They were sifting through and looking for the best things to bring back, which is a good lesson for church musicians today. Just because something is old doesn't necessarily make it good or holier, and just because something is new doesn't necessarily make it bad. You have to use a different criteria than age to determine whether or not to include a certain song in your church's worship service. And it's easy for that selection process to be a knee-jerk kind of process that's grounded more in the interpersonal politics of your church rather than, deciding whether or not a hymn should be included based on its merit as a hymn. So they set a good example for believers in any time because of how they handled that. So translation of hymns was a really big deal in this era, and the two major players, not the only players, but the two major players were Catherine Winkworth and John Mason Neale. Catherine Winkworth translated Latin hymns into the German vernacular, and she also wrote Ora Lyrica when she was only 28 years old, which was a German to English translation of Reformation hymns. And John Mason Neale translated hymns from the breviary. Paul Gerhardt's hymns continue to have an influence in this era because people were translating his hymns into many different languages, over 50 languages. Catherine Winkworth and John Kelly both translated his hymns, and then also Charles Wesley. They translated his hymns into English. So that's why we use them today in the United States. And the translators of that time were poets and theologians. You had to keep the theology intact when transferring from the original language to a new language, and somehow also make that fit into the meter and accent and fit the tune in the new language. So it's a big challenge. Without their tireless efforts, we maybe would have lost many great hymns of Christianity, like O Come, O Come, Emmanuel, because they were in, Latin or a different language, and you can't really, it's hard to sing them if they're not in your language and you don't understand what they mean. So it was really great that they translated them so we could use them. And the Oxford movement culminated in the publication of Hymns Ancient and Modern, which was this record-breaking hymnal that sold like over 200 million copies and is still in use today. I actually was at a friend's house recently and saw a copy of that hymnal on her piano, like a new copy of it. So we can learn a lot from the Oxford movement, the leaders of that movement. And that's my answer to that question.